What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you something a little bit different with a video about sort of open worlds and how I think they could change or improve. Recently, with the launch of games like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and even Avowed, which people were discussing the nature of its hub system versus open worlds, and even upcoming games like Assassin's Creed Shadows, which has, as a franchise, a history of being somewhat traditional and checklisty at times, are kind of all the reasons this is something that I've been kicking around in my own head, because it actually, somewhat loosely, I admit, relates to something else I've said previously. So if you watch a lot of my videos, you may at one point have heard me say that as somebody who has reviewed hundreds of games, what tends to stand out to me the most are games that do something unique. If I can play a game and go, wow, I've never seen that before, that is instantly more memorable to me, even if I didn't enjoy the game that much. And to that end, I kind of first want to talk about how I see open worlds, why I think they are the way that they are, and again, what they could do to improve. So starting out at a base here, I personally tend to categorize open world games into one of two categories, believe it or not, and that would basically be simulated or checklist. So simulated open worlds to me are games that are trying to at least present the illusion of a fully functioning simulation that you can interact with. Notable games in this sort of area would be things like Oblivion, the very recent Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 as an example. These games are trying to sell you on the fact that this is like a lived-in world that you can interact with and immerse yourself in that has systems to then support that experience. These are especially interesting to me because it's kind of where my own personal preference is, but even here there's a lot of variance to them because you have games like Oblivion that have an odd charm to them despite their age, but nonetheless clearly have a lot of, let's say, less than stellar quality systems that can eat into the immersion of that experience, whereas Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 very recently has shown us that with better and better systems sort of driving that situation, it can really push you into this almost dynamic setting where, just exploring has the chance of all these different things happening or interacting with systems leading to gameplay situations you might not necessarily expect, and that can be really fun and memorable and even unique all in its own right because you may very well experience something that is more or less unique to you, the player, and thus is something that sticks out in your memory. And that's why I tend to think those types of open world games do better, especially in the long term, and that's before we even start talking about things like mods. But then we have the other side of that, the checklist, the types of games that I think are behind the driving force of like open world fatigue that you kind of see these days when, you talk about an open world and everybody's kind of exhausted of it. I think these games are typically the culprit behind these, and unfortunately for Ubisoft, they're kind of the face for that kind of thing. Now, in these open worlds, typically what happens is, as the name would imply, you kind of just go around, do a thing, leave, never come back, and there aren't really a lot of systems happening dynamically around that. That's not always the case, sometimes there are things like that, but the gist of it is basically you check a thing off a list, you move on to the next slightly different area of the open world only to tick that mark off, and you keep going and going until all of that's done. Now, despite the bad rap, sometimes this can actually be pretty good if it just so happens to be in combination with things like story and quality quests and things that really flesh that world out. An example here I would give is actually Ghost of Tsushima. That is a game that, by the books, really doesn't do much differently than a lot of other checklist open worlds. But it does all of that stuff with a sort of fresh coat of paint, I believe I've described it as personally, and just little details that I think elevate that experience beyond the base level of the tools it's working with, especially when combined with its really interesting story. But unfortunately, when those things aren't present, I find that the cracks in these open worlds tend to be more apparent, and where in a sort of sandbox simulation type thing, you may very well see cracks at the edge of the systems, throwing it all together. On checklist open worlds, you kind of just notice that beyond what that checklist is, there's just nothing else happening. So you have this open world that you could theoretically explore, but there just winds up being 0 point in doing so. Now, to my mind at least, that tends to be where open worlds are today, and I want to talk a little bit about why that is, because I honestly just think it wouldn't be fair to leave it out, and that is, Honestly, for a million different reasons, I can't cover them all, but some of that is just purely from a business perspective, right? Those types of games are extremely expensive to make. All games are expensive to make these days, really, but games of this nature, open world blockbusters especially, just tend to be very, very expensive, and games that are doing very, very expensive things likely aren't going to be taking a lot of risk with that money they're spending. They want to see a return on that investment, which means they lack, frankly, the ability to be very agile in terms of things they want to try and risks they want to take. They really just don't have the wiggle room to be doing that, and so a lot of times they don't, which is why I think you can so neatly divide a lot of these games into different categories. They tend to stick to very tried and true methods. And then the other part of that is just straight up tech. Another thing about video games is that they are notoriously difficult to make, especially because doing things with different engines, especially, custom ones or proprietary engines that do exactly what you want them to do systems-wise, are extremely difficult to maintain, because then you're not only paying people to make the game, you're also paying to keep these tools updated and working, and that can lead to the buildup of things like tech debt. And as a result of that, you start to see games continuously start to work with more and more run-of-the-mill engines, like Unreal Engine 5 as an example, and that has problems with things like graphical stutter that we see over and over again, but also when you're all using the same set of tools, it's bound to come out kind of looking at least a little bit the same way, which then leads back to games are expensive, they want to take the optimized route. And when you start putting those things together, while I sincerely doubt they are, like the only factors of any given situation, I think those are important ones, especially when you start going in a little bit further and, checking out systems that have just been trademarked or copyrighted. Like, for instance, the Nemesis system from the Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War games. That is an incredible system that could really do some impressive things if set loose on a proper open world. But because of its legal status, a lot of people don't want to mess with that, because on top of the already enormous expenses, you don't really want to be paying legal bills at the same time. And all of that to say, things aren't hopeless, In fact, I do think there are some recent examples of games, not even necessarily fully open world, doing some interesting things that I think, if applied in interesting ways to open worlds, could make them fresher experiences. Because even now, a well-done game in the sort of styles in which I've already described still lands. I mean, just look at KCD2. I myself described it as kind of what I wanted to see Oblivion doing and going forward and iterating upon. Because games like that just have a way of pulling you in and getting you really invested. But there are other options, or at least other things that you could potentially play around with to make these games more interesting. And to use probably the easiest example possible, we have something like Elden Ring. Elden Ring, I think, is a great example of an open world doing something not necessarily brand new, but different enough to make it stand out. And while Elden Ring has its problems, I think largely because it was the first game trying to do what it did, which is take the Souls-like formula and move that to an open world experience. And just immediately you have something unique, because those Souls-like games, especially FromSoft, give you a very unique experience. And then you move that experience into a slightly different medium, this big open world with all these secrets and stuff to uncover, and you've sort of by default made something that is itself very unique. And while it's certainly not the only reason, I do think that played a big role in why Elden Ring was as successful as it was. But even then, I also think you can look at games that were less successful, like Star Wars Outlaws, a game I myself even gave a buy on sale. But the reason I actually think it's still important to go over and talk about games like that is because there is actually systems that Star Wars Outlaws uses that are unique and interesting, at least to me. Namely, its reputation system and how it impacts various missions. So while Outlaws isn't truly open world, it's got open zones you can run through, which is itself kind of a hub system, I suppose. You'll have a reputation with various factions that inhabit those zones, and the level of reputation you have with those factions determines your access to certain areas in those zones. Meaning that if a faction likes you, you can usually freely walk through their territory up to a point. And then oftentimes, side quests, main story missions even take place within those zones many times. Meaning that your access to and the reaction from the inhabitants of a given area changes dynamically based on your reputation with them. That's actually a system Outlaws uses that I really, really enjoyed. And when you start putting all of that together, we can finally get to my main point here. Basically, a lot of open worlds are getting stale. I do kind of feel like they tend to be more driven by telemetry than actual player experience and what you might find unique about those games. Oftentimes we're seeing these games be pumped out, but most of them just feel like the exact same versions of previous games that we have seen with a slightly different story and characters, especially when they're all made in the same engine these days. And while there's certainly still room in those genres and styles for it to be successful, I think if we really want to see open worlds improve, I think they've just got to lean into things that make those experiences unique. Not just, is this a fun version of something that's been done 1,000 times, but does this offer the player something they have never seen and will therefore be memorable as a result of that? And I think if you genuinely ask yourself that question about a lot of open world games, the answer is probably going to be no. And I think that is exactly what results in this sort of fatigue with these types of experiences. And yet, even then, that is admittedly talking purely on a sort of mechanical and systems-oriented level. I do think there are room for just incredibly well-told stories and tried-and-true tactics and genres, and while not every game needs to reinvent the wheel in this way, if you're not going to reinvent the wheel, you've really got to offer a unique experience based on the world in which you are building this game. Because if these open worlds ultimately lack unique features, and they also aren't particularly interesting to explore otherwise in terms of both how you interact with the world via, one type of open world or the other, or what you can learn about it through side quests and interesting characters, then I think that is very likely a game headed for an underwhelming launch. And you do that enough over, potentially decades, and then I think you find yourself in the position Ubisoft finds themselves in today. So all of that together, all of my rambling out of the way, basically just to say this. I think open world games, despite the fatigue that is tending to surround them in most cases, can and should still be really interesting experiences. But in order to do that, you have to sit down and ask yourself, is this an interesting proposition to be made, or is it really just more of the same? And unfortunately, the people in positions to actually ask those questions and make the decisions to allocate money to various projects are mostly people who are going to lean on tried and true data to make those experiences, which is why we get just a million of the same thing. As these projects are ultimately extremely expensive, and most companies simply aren't going to take the risk at that level to lead to the innovation a lot of people would like to see, and that's why we see smaller iterations and obviously things like the indie and AA space, but those don't tend to translate to these large blockbuster style games where you might actually see a truly open world, which is ultimately why we don't exactly get a KCD2 all the time. That's a tremendous game that I think took the great foundation of its initial entry, albeit, rough around the edges to say the least, and then built that into a really incredible experience. But honestly, most companies don't get that far. And that's why games like that, I think, wind up being so special and get met with such an incredibly positive player reception, because the sort of market, if you will, or the hunger for those games and that, driving forward of systems and ideas is present in a way that the market seems unable and unwilling to fulfill. Not least of which because it's very easy to simply make a YouTube video like this and wax poetic about what is and what should be, but it's obviously a very different situation to then turn that into real, actual products that get made and sold, which obviously puts us at a bit of an impasse. But lucky for all of us, there are still plenty of fantastic, smaller or handcrafted even experiences to be had. The world is ultimately not hurting for video games by any stretch, and I'm going to be along for the ride one way or the other. But it is the kind of issue that I've at least seen or identified that I hope gets addressed with both time and tech, because I really do think that's the kind of thing that if studios could solve, at least in an issue of balancing all the various factors I've brought up over the course of this video, could really make for some memorable and truly interesting experiences. But in the meantime, there's always more video games to play, and I think we'll wind up being just fine either way. And with that, I think I'm pretty much going to wrap up this video, which was extremely rambly. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, by all means, let me know what you think about this and anything else, I suppose, down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.